Hi everyone, this is Kelly, and I started thinking about decks. Actually, what started this is I was doing a reading for a client and I was using the Wayhome Tarot, and I was like, oh, this is just such a good deck for, it's just clear shooter, right? It's just a clear shooter. It's just such a wonderful deck for that. And you know, it's what I go to for that type of thing, right? And it just got me thinking about decks that I go to for very specific purposes. And I thought I would do a tarot deck and an oracle deck. Now, I have really limited, you know me, I use many different decks, but I really limited myself to one tarot and one oracle. And the spaces these are spaces that are, you know, I go to all the time, right? They may be different for you, or, you know, I'd love to hear in the comment section for these areas. Would you have a favorite tarot deck or a favorite oracle deck for those areas? So the areas that I've chosen are for clarity, workhorse decks, my personal practice decks, liminal space decks, that sort of in between transitional energy, personal support decks, and then I do have a subcategory of ancestral work, because that is really part of my almost everyday practice, and so I couldn't leave that out. I could go in personal practice, but I kind of look at these things differently. Now, some of these decks cross platform. So these are decks that I go to a lot for various reasons. For example, I use the Lantern Oracle a lot in Ancestral space. In fact, right now I'm using it a lot there. I definitely use the Shaman's Oracle for both these areas. I use Illuminated Earth for so a lot of these do cross over, but they're just decks that, I don't know, right this moment in time. I didn't go deep and pull from, you know, only these favorites or anything like that. Sorry, let me turn my voice off here, the ding-donging here. Anything like that. I really did just say, okay, what's out? Like, these are all decks that are out. I didn't have to go hunt for them. They are literally, most of these were actually out of their boxes in personal space. You know, so what is active in these areas? And I just thought I'd do a quickish, I don't know why I ever say quick, so quickish video. I don't intend for this to be long, but I decided to do a quickish video on sort of these decks that just work really well for me in these particular areas, and a quick maybe why, right? And again, if you're interested in letting me know, or taking a picture on Instagram and listing them, putting it in the comment section, do a video on it, whatever. I'd love to hear. And if you need to change up your, you know, what your areas would be, go for it, right? This is not limiting. But for me, it's clarity, workhorse decks, personal practice, liminal space, personal support, and ancestral work, because these are go-to areas. So I'm going to start with, I guess what I should do is take these, I'm going to get them all out of order if I'm not careful. So we'll try to do this so that I can get back to these in some semblance of a way. So we'll start here with a section for clarity. Again, there's a lot of decks I could have chosen for this, so this is not a definitive list for me of my own decks, but these are decks that are out and being used, and why I find these as clarity. So the Wayhome Tarot is a tarot deck. Obviously, it's Wayhome Tarot, but I actually just find this was a deck I never intended to get, because I really just didn't think it was something that I would like. That kind of sold me on it, as well as my friend Patrick just sold me on it. But anyways, this deck is just super clear. You know, it definitely has a bit of a more modern vibe for me. You know, I'm not a big, you know, I don't lean towards modern decks, but it just reads so clear. It's just, let's get there, let's do the work. It's clean, it's clear, it's bright, you know, it's got some good colors. It's you know, it's a nice, just normal size. It riffle shuffles like a dream. Like it has a beautiful back. It just works really well to just get in there and do the job with clarity. Now I have my other Workhorse section, but this is about, it's just clean. It feels clean. It feels clear. It brings a lot of clarity when I just want to do the job. Another deck would be, say, the Fountain Tarot in this position. It just has that sense of cleanness and clarity, but I'm just using this deck a lot. Now, this one's interesting in this category. This could have gone in a lot of categories, to be honest. I'm really loving this deck. But this is another one. I had no intention of purchasing both of these decks, no intention of purchasing these decks. And both of these decks I love and use a lot. I don't necessarily use them together, but I use these in sense of clarity. The reason I love this is that there is a suit system, right? So there is 11 cards for Maiden, 11 cards for Mother, 11 cards for Guardian, and 11 cards for Crone. So you get that bit of a trajectory. Where are you at in a situation has worked really well for me. But it also kind of gets at the shadow and the light of things. It does sort of see, okay, let's get some clarity about what is actually going on in the situation. It's not just here's some support. I do think it is a supportive deck, but it really gets at the clarity of what needs to happen, what needs to be done, what needs to work at. I just find it to be a clean hitter, a clear hitter, if that makes sense. And I guess that's what I looked at these two decks of having in common, is that they're both clear hitters, and you know, not that has anything to do with it, but both of them were not decks that I would have probably purchased if somebody, my friend Patrick and then my friend Jamie, gave me sort of a peek at it. And there were a couple cards that said, okay, I want to get it for that, but it's probably not going to become a deck I use a lot. And they're both just super clear hitters for me. They really bring a lot of clarity about what's going on, what I need to pay attention to. It's just, they're just clear decks, very clear, clarity defining decks. Okay, the next section was Workhorse decks, right? So there's no question of, these two were just no-brainers for me. And again, I have a lot of Workhorse tarot decks that I really lean into, but there's no set question that since I have gotten Oak, Ash, and Thorn, I just use this deck constantly. I don't know why it's flip-flop. Oh, that's the possibilities card. So this is by Three Oaks Tarot. I always get that wrong. Yeah, Three Trees Tarot, not Three Oaks. Oak, Ash, and Thorn. It's an animal deck, but it isn't an animal deck in terms of an animal oracle deck. It's a tarot deck that has animals in it. It has a single type of animals in each of the suits. It leans towards the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it has some of my favorite cards outside of that, like the Eight of Wands is one of my all-time favorite Eight of Wands. It's just beautiful. It's a good size for doing larger readings for in my table space. It shuffles gorgeous. There is animals in the forest, which makes me happy. Like, there's just nothing about this deck that I don't really love. And I use it a lot. I use it a lot. Every single one, I think this last year, every single one almost, unless requested otherwise or something just really called me to it. All of my year aheads, all of my Wheel of the Years were done with the with this deck, and also this deck, although that's not why I chose these two, but as a matter of fact, both of these decks together, all of my year aheads and Wheel of the Years were done with these two decks. It's just, but I just use it for my astrology, any of my readings that are larger readings, because it's a great size, it's a great card weight, it's pleasant to shuffle, it's pleasant to look at, it's clean to read, like it's just a workhorse. Like, I could really just take this deck and probably be happy. I'm not saying it's like my soul deck, although maybe it is. No, but truly it would be on the list of that, if I had to choose one deck to keep forever and use that one, it would be hard for this not to be in the running, and that's not the purpose of this video, but it would be hard for this not to be in the running, because it just it just works really well, and I love it. So and I've used it a ton. So that's my workhorse current work. Again, I have other decks in that category, but I was choosing one, and it's that currently fits the category. The other has to be Illuminated Earth. This I've had for far longer than this, but this deck is a workhorse deck. This is the Illuminated Earth Oracle, and I use the heck out of this thing. I use it for everything. It goes with, visually, like the color palette is so beautiful, but it goes with everything that obviously goes with my color palette, because it pretty much goes with any tarot deck that I have and that I use regularly. What I love about it is that it's Illuminated Earth. It's talking about bigger earth energies. It's not looking them as being negative. So for example, a tempest, it's a natural storm. It's not evil. It's not bad. It just is what it is. We need to be aware of it. Even destruction, it's just the natural energies that are around us, that we just have to be aware that they're there so that we can work with them. I just find this to be visually, thematically, a workhorse. I use it in so many different ways with so many different decks, and I've never put it away since I've gotten it, and I've had this for a while. You'd have to look up my walkthrough to see how long, but I've definitely had this for a while. She's made another deck since then, and I like it, but not to the level of the Illuminated Earth, which is just a workhorse. I can really take this if I'm going out of town and I have a couple different types of readings, a couple different tarot decks. I can take this and it is going to fill the gap of anything that I need it to do. So these two for me are workhorse decks. So that's those two. Now, the next category was personal practice. So, when I get into my personal practice, there's just no question. And again, I use these decks constantly. They are never in the box. I put them in the box for purposes so you could see them. But these two, as well as the Illuminated Earth, as well as the Weaver's Oracle, are always out in my personal practice nature altar. They are always out because I pull them for ancestral readings, web readings, readings for myself, doing workings, and things like that. They're workhorses in my personal practice. And that is the Crow Tarot, which is by MJ Cullinane. I'm always slaughter her name. I feel bad. It's a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but because it's crows like this, for me it functions like, because you know me, I don't know why I have some upside down cards. I obviously shuffled wrong last time, but I like, the cardstock is US Games. I like US Games cardstock. It shuffles well, but it's very neutral to me. It functions like a pip deck for me. That's going to drive me nuts. So while we're talking, I'm going to put it in order, or right side up. It functions as a pip deck for me. I think it's just because of the crows, and even though it is very Rider-Waite-Smith, I am able to just do what I want to do with it. Nothing inhibits me. It goes again in terms of coloration with all the decks that I use in my personal practice. I do use this with clients for, I think, a lot in my web reading, but that's because that's using those other decks that I use in my personal practice. But it's just a deck that goes well with any of the Oracle decks that I use in my personal practice. And so I really didn't have a good tarot deck that sort of worked well with all the Oracle decks. I find I use maybe more Oracle decks than tarot decks in my personal practice, which is surprising. But I never really had that tarot deck that just really worked well with everything until this one. And this was it just completely filled that slot. And again, it's Rider-Waite-Smith, but for whatever reason, because of the artwork, because of all the crows instead of people, I'm able to really just use it like a pip deck, and it works beautifully. lovely. I could not do a deck thing like this without, and the book's not even in here because that never gets put away. So neither of these decks were in the boxes, and they just, I just did that so you could see the boxes. This is the Shaman's Oracle by John Matthews. I've done, really every deck I'm talking about today I should have a walkthrough of, but this is just a workhorse. The suits in the system along with the titles in the system, so the suit plus the title plus the message from the cards in this deck are just amazing. It's an amazing resource. I use it for ancestor readings. I use it for personal workings. I use it for just, I can't, just all kinds of personal practice usages. I absolutely love this deck. I don't love the cardstock. This had borders on it, and once those borders started chipping, I trimmed them off, and now I have this part. When this starts to fall apart, I have, I think, 2 backups because I use it so much, and it doesn't have the greatest cardstock, but it's well worth it because I just love this deck, and I get so much use out of it. So these are, again, always out on my personal practice altar space, and so yeah, those are those 2. What's next? Liminal space. I really wanted to have this because, again, I use these decks a lot, and this was just one of those spaces. So this is for me mostly past life work because I do a lot of past life work both for clients and for myself. But also I found these decks to also go very well in those transitional spaces, right? Past life energy is very transitional, and as well as big transitions when you're, in that space where the world has flipped on your head. These decks work very well, and for me, in those transitional spaces. I have done so. This is one of my most used tarot decks, which is the Darkness of Light, and I don't know why. I couldn't exactly tell you why I use this in this way. Like, I use it a lot in almost all of my past life readings. Sometimes I'll put something else in there, but I've used it so much. It's very classic feeling. The use of light and darkness speaks to sort of those liminal edge spaces, and it just, I don't know. That's just how I tend to use this a lot, and I just love this as a tarot deck. That's my favorite ever Chariot card in here. It is Rider-Waite-Smith based, but I just kind of work with it. It works fine. I can get around anything I need to get around. And there's just something about the color palette that feels very liminal space. And so while I have other decks in that category, such as the Hush Tarot and even the John Bauer Tarot that I would use a lot for myself personally, I do use this a lot, both of these a lot with clients, where I don't use those other 2 decks with clients. So I don't know, the Darkness of Light, it's that space between the shafts of light and the deepest shadows, and it works really well for me there. And then, of course, the Cosma Vision. So I know this is just coming out. A lot of people are just starting to work with this, but I've been working with this for 8 months, and it is just, I just love this deck so much. Mostly I use it for past life, but it also works amazing for being in those in-between spaces. The whole major arcana of this is not a tarot, it's an oracle, but it has a majors. The whole majors is based on liminal space, that space between one life and the next. So it's, it's very well keyed for working in that liminal transitional space between jobs, feeling like your world has crashed down, between relationships, loss of a loved one, like just those big occurrences in life that cause us to feel like we're stuck in a liminal space. This deck works really well for, as well as past life. So it is kind of funny that both of these are, not funny, I mean, it makes sense, right? They're both decks that I use with past life readings, but they're also both decks that I use in liminal space because, past lives are very liminal space energies. So it makes sense that I would have them in that category. And I find this very useful. We are often in those spaces of in-between, and we are often the most disconcerted when we're in those in-between spaces. And so having decks that help us navigate that space, I think, is very useful. Certainly it is for me. Maybe I just spend a lot of time there. So that is the liminal space category. The next category is personal support. Now, this changes a lot for me, right? It just really depends what's going on. But again, I limited myself to what is on my altar space for personal support. And so I've got 2 decks here. Now, well, obviously I have 2 decks in all the categories. These complement each other, and I don't necessarily use them together, although like right now down in my personal support and the space that I like candles for people if they're in need of support, I generally have 2, I'll pull 2 decks, 2 cards there, and so I'll use these there, but I also use the Weaver's Oracle in other readings as well. I only ever pull 1. I only ever pull 1. So again, it's interesting, some of the correlations. I didn't think those things through, but the correlation to these 2 decks are I only ever pull 1, I only ever pull 1. So this deck is called, I'm gonna get the name wrong, I don't know if it's called the Mother Mary. I don't know if it's called the Mother Mary too. It's my most expensive deck. Please don't remind me in the comments of how expensive it is. It is very expensive deck, but that I've ever purchased, that's for sure. But my friend Patrick just insisted that, and I bought it, he didn't, but he bought his own, but he just kept saying, you've got to get this, you've got to get this, you've got to get this. I'm like, I'm really more of a goddess oracle or a Weaver's Oracle kind of, that's more me, right? Like, this is my foundation, this is where I came out of in terms especially of Catholicism and Christianity, but it isn't, this cardstock is amazing. I do love to shuffle it. But it's an amazing deck. I do want to do a walkthrough of it. I've done some really intense sort of going in and seeing the correlations and going in and sort of analyzing it for some themes and such, but I'm not there yet. Right now it's just kind of my own thing. But for me, this is very similar to, say, and I still have that deck, what is that called? Guardian Angel Tarot by Colette, no, not by Colette Baron-Reid, by Doreen Virtue. My only Doreen Virtue deck, I think, now. But that has that sort of touchstone into my grandmother energy, right? So both of these really feel very grandma energy to me, but in different ways. And so when I pull a card, again, I pull them. One, the guidebook on this is phenomenal. The guidebook on this is phenomenal. The guidebook on this is phenomenal. She doesn't, it's not just in Christianity, right, which is not my path, but it is part of my history and it's part of my foundations, and that's something that I don't, that I've learned to be comfortable with. I've had to sort of bypass fundamental Baptist and go back to my very comfortable Catholic roots, but it's my touchstone, right? This is, I do come from Christianity as well, even though it's not my personal practice. But what I love is that she uses Mary as the face, the many faces of Mary, as the many faces of other energy, fairy tales, goddesses, and connects them beautifully in the guidebook. So for me, this speaks to that divine force that is throughout story, throughout fairy tales, throughout mythologies, which hold the different cultural goddess energies. It encompasses all of those things, and she did an amazing job with that. So I pull one of these for personal support over where all of my candles are at. But then also, this is also grandmother for me. So this is the Weaver's Oracle. And these are weavers and grandmothers and shamans and Udagons. These are power, all female, although not all feminine. This feels more feminine than this, although this doesn't actually as much as you would think. There's a lot of both energy in here. But this one for sure. This is actually, I would almost say that this skews to women in their masculine expressions, because this, and again, masculine not meaning male gender, but that active masculine, traditional masculine energy, this feels much more masculine in energy, because it's just, yeah. Again, I only ever pull one of these, and I generally always sit with it for a month. This has, ever since I held this in my hand, actually somebody sent me their second deck that they had of this that it didn't have a guidebook. I think there were some issues with the deck. And as soon as I held it, that same day that I got it, I purchased. This wasn't cheap either, well worth every penny. And what the power for me in this is in the guidebook. The guidebook has a story. Well, it is in the names. The titles are really hard hitters, but and the images are amazing. But for me, there's a story with each one of these, and the story really brings this deck to life, just like this guidebook really brings this deck to life. So these are, I don't know, like personal power, personal support decks. I don't use this for clients at all. This I do use for clients in a web reading that I have. But they're both single card pulls and very supportive energy. And I use them for myself in that personal support space where I light candles for myself. And I also light candles for other people that are in need of support. And so that's that deck. Or those two decks. Okay. I'm almost done, and my computer screen went off, so now I have to see. I think there's only one more category. Yes. And this is my ancestral space, and this is something separate for me. Do I gain personal support here? 1000%. But I also get kicked in the butt here. I also get motivated here. I also do a lot of personal healing work for myself and for my ancestors here. Like, there's a lot that goes down. There's a lot going down in my ancestor altar. You know, I do workings there. I do get messages there on the almost, like, I would say every other day I'm doing readings and messages for myself. But yes, it's all supportive energy, but those are kind of more like hug and challenging hugs over there, whereas this is really like I'm doing a lot of work. Now, again, in my ancestral space, my oracle decks rotate out. I use this deck. I use the Lantern Oracle, which you've already seen. I'm working right now with an new Ancestral Spirits deck, but I haven't had that very long. So my Oracle deck there does sort of rotate out, but this just needed to be because this could go in the Workhorse category. This could go in the support category. I wouldn't say so much in the clarity, but personal practice, support, ancestral work, and Workhorse, this deck could go in. That's how much I use this deck. I've never put it back in the box since I got it. It's in the bag here. It sits right on the side of the table over there. I use this for myself. I use this for clients. I love this deck. It's extremely supportive and empowering, and I use it for so much, as I just named all those categories. Like, I use this deck so much, but I put it here because, like, I could have put the Lantern Oracle here, but that really is a clarity seeking deck. So anyways, I had to kind of pick and choose where I was going to put things. But I do love to use this in Ancestor Space. I know other people who use this in Ancestor Space as well, and it's all around one of my most used decks. I would say of my Oracle decks, my most used Oracle decks are the Shaman's Oracle, this deck here, which is called the Spirit Cards Oracle, as well as the Illuminated Earth, are probably my most used Oracle decks, but I don't know. You know how it is with those things, but it's definitely high up there. My understanding is that the creator, John Arthur Mosley, is creating another deck that should be able to maybe just add into this with some more masculine energy, which would make it perfection for me. I hope that that's the case, but don't quote me on that. But there's just no way that I cannot have this deck in one of these categories, and this is sort of where it's ended up. I'm just going to put it back over here because it doesn't leave over there. And then this is, I can't not talk about my Ancestral Space without talking about Vision Quest. I have several decks that I use in my Ancestral Space of tarot decks. Ancestral Path, this deck, Primordial Tarot, even Tarot of the Hidden Realms, but almost 90% of the last year and a half, I've gotten messages using this Vision Quest deck. Now, I know that this deck has a lot of issues in terms of, this is an older deck. I think this was released in this, let's see if I can see. It says 1998. For some reason I thought it was older than that. But anyways, 1998. Still, that's, you know, been around a while. That's 23 years. So that's I would say that qualifies as an older deck. I picked this up to do some work with in my ancestor space as ancestor of the land, right? Because I have ancestors. One of them, Susanna, and I have, well, that would be been her English name. So I do have ancestors, 2 ancestresses, both female, in my family. That I do, want to do some healing work with and connection work with. And so that, but also for me, it was more about ancestors of the land. I am from the United States. I am American, and the land and the soil that I live on, that I was born on, that I gave birth to my children on, that I have had my son die on, and that I will someday die on is America. And that is a complicated history, like every single other land that anybody out there is living on. The history of our land and the peoples on it are complicated ones, and on every single land. So some of it was working with that, and I just wanted really neutral. I really believe in paying attention to that there are a variety of Native American cultures. I do know the tribes that my ancestresses came from, so I think that understanding that they are separate tribes with some ideas that cross over and some that don't is very important. But just thinking about ancestry of land, I picked this deck up to look at it, understanding its problematic nature in terms of certainly in the ways that tarot decks are being looked at today. But I will say, I use this in some ways more like an oracle deck. The keywords feel a little bit more like they're Thoth based. They feel Thothy, I guess is the best way I can say it. I don't know that she has any connection to Thoth, but it does feel much more Thoth based, which is not how I read. So for example, I don't read Seven of Waters or Seven of Cups as excess. So this to me feels like more of a Thoth. But I don't struggle with it. I really do a lot of it. I just use it as an oracle deck and use the keywords on it. And I just can't, I don't know what to say. Should this be the deck that has such a powerful impact? I don't know, but it does. I have gotten so many readings with this deck in Ancestor Space that have just hit home time after time after time after time, the keyword, mostly using the keywords, and it's just been a very powerful deck for me in that space. And so that I can't talk about those decks that really do it in a particular topic without mentioning it. So that's the Vision Quest Tarot and the Spirit Cards Oracle deck. So those are let's see if I can pull them back here. Those are my 6 categories, and that is a tarot deck and a oracle deck for each of those categories. Again, I would love to see what decks you would pick in those categories, and or again, if some of those categories don't relate to you, like if you don't work with ancestral energy, then you can throw something in there or just leave that off. Or if you don't have a personal practice, your decks don't change, do what you want with it. But I'd love to hear sort of when you have those decks that really function well in specific categories. It just, I don't know, it piqued my interest today, so I thought I would do the video. So I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.